Hey friends, it's me, Shannon. While I create this cute little sketchbook spread with alcohol markers, I want to tell you the story of how I packed up and lived out of my car while spending 3 weeks driving across the American West. This idea came to me about probably 3 years ago, and I became obsessed with this idea that I wanted to go on a road trip all across the American West. I wanted to hit a bunch of the national forests, and I wanted to camp out of my car while I did it. I started watching a bunch of videos. I joined several groups of people who did car camping, solo car camping, learned just the different products, must have, things that they needed, things that they had, things that they did, tips and tricks and all of that. And I spent months and months planning this, just slowly buying the things that I needed over time, figuring out how I was going to convert my little rogue SUV into a home on wheels for me without actually doing any type of building. Over time, I figured it out. I figured out the best way to set it up so that I had a bed and I had a place for all of my clothes. I took a million art supplies with me that I did not need, and I packed up, and literally the day after school ended, I hit the road and started out west. The idea was that I would find different places to sleep each night, preferably places that I didn't have to hide that I was sleeping there. I was prepared for stealth camping if I needed to do that. I used a couple different apps and websites. Campendium was an app that I used, and then freecampsites.org I think was one that I used. If I remember to, I'll put the links to those in the description. It's the summer of 2024, June. School has ended. I pack everything up all by my lonesome self, hop in my car, and I head out. And my first day was a long day of driving. My goal was to reach Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, and I did. I got there. I spent several hours at Mount Rushmore walking around, just enjoying my time. And here's the thing, like, this entire trip, I guess I should mention, this was only about 3 months after losing my middle son. It was a bittersweet trip. I had been planning this trip for almost a year, and I almost didn't go on it because of losing Caleb. I decided that it was something I needed to do. It was bittersweet. The solitude was immensely healing. And I spent several hours at Mount Rushmore, walking around, just taking in the park, took lots of pictures. In one of my other videos, I'm sure I talked about how, or it may be a video that's coming where I talk about how I was blocked on art. I did take a lot of photographs on this trip. And after I was done at the park, there was a lovely little park up not too far from Mount Rushmore. It was at a trailhead, and they allowed for overnight camping. I decided to park there for the night, and it was fairly busy, actually. There was quite a few people, and it's interesting the things that you think you're going to do before you go on a trip like this, and then the things that you actually decide you like better when you're on the trip are not always the same things. When I got there were a lot of people there, and at first I was a little hesitant because I was just nervous having a lot of people around. I just wasn't sure what to expect. The people that I was parked the closest to, they were really nice, really sweet. We chatted for a few minutes, and then they left me alone to do my thing. I left them alone to do their thing. It ended up being a lovely night. I was sitting outside of my car at one point, and this cute little muskrat, I must have been too close to its den because it decided that I was not a friend, and it started grabbing each of its babies and then running them from its current den to a den far away from me. It was the most adorable thing. It was very unhappy that I was parked as close as I was. And I wasn't actually that close to it. It was cute. Anyways, the second day I set out, and the second day was, I had various places that I wanted to stop. It wasn't going to be a full day of driving. On the second day, I started by going to the Crazy Horse Memorial, and I spent, a little bit of time there. That particular memorial is not quite finished. It is also not a national memorial. It is a privately owned and privately funded memorial. I highly suggest, if you are in the area, please stop and help support them, because it really is a great memorial, especially considering it's only about 30 minutes from Mount Rushmore, where we have this enormous national monument to U.S. presidents. I think that the Native Americans who lived on these lands deserve just as much recognition. Please go support them. After Crazy Horse, I drove to what is known as the Devil's Tower, and that was in Wyoming. It's interesting because I love the Devil's Tower. It was quite a busy place. Like, it took me a long time to get in and get parked because traffic was backed up. You could actually see it without going into the park. This beautiful natural landscape, it's called the Devil's Tower. There's an indigenous story about it that ties back to the Pleiades, who are known as the Seven Sisters, and they are a star system near Orion, and there's a whole Greek myth about these seven sisters. The indigenous people from the US have their own stories about this star cluster, and they believe in a very similar story that these sisters were being chased and that the ground rose up out and placed the sisters into the sky. Very similar, and that's what created the Devil's Tower. What's really interesting about that is the Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters, from Greek mythology, are a group of beings that I am currently researching as part of my spiritual exploration. Then, after Devil's Tower, I continued on to Bighorn Canyon. My initial plan was to drive the Beartooth Pass the next day. I was trying to get as close as I could to it to drive it the next day. However, the day before I was going to drive it, it had literally just opened, because this pass is snow covered for most of the year. It's only clear for about a month and a half to 2 months that you can actually drive on it. And it had only just opened. It was supposed to open Memorial Day weekend, and it didn't because of snow and storms. It had just opened, and the day before I was going to drive on it, there was an avalanche. Now, it was still open and you could still drive on it. There was still a risk of more avalanches. I decided it probably would not be a good idea for me to do that, especially since on that pass, communication was going to be very limited and I was alone. I opted to go a different route. I ended day 2 in the Devil's Canyon Overlook in Bighorn Canyon. I don't want to sit here throughout this video and tell you, oh my gosh, it was so beautiful, because every place that I went was awe-inspiring. And I have photographs of all of them. By the way, if you're interested in these photographs, I offer them as a package for that artists can purchase to use for inspiration, and that is in my Etsy store, and it is the landscape photography package. If you're interested in it, you can find it in my Etsy store linked in the description. I ended watching the sunset over Devil's Canyon Overlook, and then I went and found my park up for the night, which was just a small little city park that allowed overnight camping. So then day 3, I drove into Yellowstone, and I spent the entire day at Yellowstone. One thing that you have to understand about me is I can spend an entire day somewhere. Spending an entire week is not necessary for me. I go, I soak it up, I enjoy it, I spend the time there, and then I can move on. I spent the entire day at Yellowstone. And if you've ever been to Yellowstone, you know that it's quite a drive to go all the way around Yellowstone. It takes quite a while to drive it. I entered at the northeast gate and I hit the spots that I wanted to see. Old Faithful and some of the others. Yellowstone is absolutely beautiful. Could I do a whole video on Yellowstone alone? Yes, probably. The point of this video is not to talk about every single thing that I saw. It's to tell you about this adventure that I went on and the intricacies of what happened to me while I was on this trip. For example, the day that I drove into Yellowstone, I drove in pretty much in tears. I was in tears for quite a while because I was still heavily grieving at this point. And I had constant thoughts of, I just need to turn around and go home. And I kept pushing myself, Shannon, no, you've planned for this and your son would not want you to go home without doing and seeing the things that you had planned to see. It was a big fight with myself of back and forth. This happened every couple days. I was like, I just need to turn around and go home. But I persevered and I kept going. I think one of the big questions a lot of people ask solo car campers, particularly female solo car campers, is if they're scared. I know the type of world that we live in, but it seems weird to me. That's one of the number one questions that I see other car campers answering is, are they scared to be a solo traveler? Are they scared wherever it is that they're parking overnight? And what I found was, I thought that the more abandoned places were going to be the ones that were more comfortable for me. And what I found out on this trip was that I actually liked the places that were not completely abandoned, but were not overcrowded. If there were just a few other people there car camping, that seemed to be about the right sweet spot for me. And other people, that might be completely different. The other funny thing is, before I left on the trip, I was like, I'm not staying at any rest stops. Rest stops aren't safe. I'm not going to stay at any of them. And then what I actually found was that rest stops were one of the places that I absolutely loved to stay. Day 3, I finished Yellowstone. I found my place for the night. Day 4, I went to the Craters of the Moon in Idaho. This is the first time I had ever heard of a night sky park. If you are not familiar with what this is, there are several national parks and monuments that are designated as night sky parks. And their tagline is, where half of the park happens after dark. I didn't know this going there because if I had, I would have planned to arrive at a different time so that I could have enjoyed the park during the day and in the evening. But I didn't do that. I only got to see the park during the day. Craters of the Moon. Oh my gosh, gorgeous. I have since named this trip my Devil's Trip because of the number of places that I saw along the way that were named after the devil. For example, at Craters of the Moon, there was the Devil's Orchard Trail. I got out and I walked a lot of the trails. I'm not a very physical person. On this entire journey, I kept to trails that were under 2 miles just because I knew my limit. But what was really great is a lot of these places also had really short areas, and some of them were like even wheelchair accessible. I really appreciated that. And then there's a road in Idaho called the Loop Road, and I drove part of that. And then the next day, I finished like the Idaho Scenic Drive, and that took me into Seattle. I drove that into Seattle. And then I spent my evening in Seattle. I hit Molly Moon's, which is an ice cream store, and Elliott Bay Books. And then I found a rest area to sleep in for the night. And I have to tell you that the rest areas in Washington are probably some of my favorite. They're beautiful, they're clean, they're comfortable, and they felt safe. If you're in Washington and you need to stop, a rest area is a great place. But then the next day I went back into Seattle, and I had originally planned to do a lot of things in Seattle. But increasingly, as I have gotten older, my stamina for being around people and being in public just has decreased quite a bit. I did spend the entire day in Seattle. I went to I think that's how it said, Gardens and Glass, which that was gorgeous. It was like a botanical gardens. And then Chuli, I'm probably butchering his name, I'm sorry, is a glass, like a blown glass artist. There were lots of pieces in the gardens. That was really beautiful. But the pièce de résistance, which I realize I did not say that, the pièce de résistance in Seattle was the Museum of Popular Culture, or MPOP. And like, I had bought a ticket that got me into those two, and then I think it got me into something else. I don't remember, but I didn't end up going to any of the other places that I planned on going because I spent so much time at the Museum of Pop Culture. It was amazing. It is probably the best museum I have ever been in. The exhibit on Nirvana and Kurt Cobain was astounding. And not just because they were pivotal in creating grunge music, which, hello, I'm a teen of the 90s. Grunge is my deal. But like, just walking through and seeing these 90s photographs and these mixed cassette tapes and the nostalgia that it brought back. I own these things. This was a huge part of my childhood. It was amazing. If you go to Seattle, I highly suggest MPOP. There was shopping places and other stores that were highly recommended. And I got tired, and I listened to my body and said, no, I'm done for the day. By the way, parking in Seattle is atrocious. I was able to find a place that was an all-day parking garage for $15, which that was the best deal that I saw all over the city. And luckily it was in the area that I was going to be in. Thank goodness. I decided to go ahead and head up to Blaine, Washington, which is where I was going to stay for the night. I did have to stop in Linwood to go to a Daiso, because guess what? I do not have a Daiso anywhere near me. I have discovered that there is one about 3 hours away now. I literally took a trip down to my best friend's in Texas so that I could go to Daiso once. Anyways, I had to stop at Daiso, and then I parked for the night in Blaine, Washington, because the next day I was going to enter Canada. And fun fact about me, up to that point, I had never been out of the country. I have lived all over the United States, including Hawaii, but I had never been out of the United States. I went into Canada and I took a ferry from British Columbia, the mainland, to Vancouver Island. And I spent the day around Victoria. I went to, oh my gosh, what was the place called? You know what? I don't know why I can never remember the name of it, but there's a castle. I will link it down in the description because I can't recall the name of it right now, but the Royal Castle, it's a university now. But I went on a tour of that, and then I actually drove from Victoria to almost the entire other side of Vancouver Island, because the next morning I was going on a wildlife boating tour. It was about a 3-hour drive. and I ended up staying I was going to stay at a free campsite, but when I got there, they were full. The lovely camp host, he told me that there were some turnoffs on the road that I had used to come in and that I could camp along those. I ended up pulling into one of those and camping, and it was like, that was one of those instances where nobody else was around, but it was so quiet and peaceful and wonderful. I loved it. I loved my entire time in Canada. Vancouver Island is thebomb.com. Yes, I just did say that. I would go back there in a heartbeat. I would spend an entire vacation there. So the next day, I ended up going on this small company run wildlife tour. The people who ran it, they owned and lived on the boat, and they didn't guarantee that you saw whales, but they did guarantee that you would see wildlife. And we did. We saw whales, we saw bears, we saw white-tailed does, we saw lots of eagles, lots of American eagles. I guess those would be considered Canadian eagles since they lived in Canada. Anyways, it was just, the trip was more than I could have asked for. And what's funny is, like, afterwards, they sent me an email thanking me for coming and everything, and they asked if I would leave a Google review. And now, here's the sad thing is, I know that year was their last year and they were going to retire. They're probably not in business anymore. But it's funny because I left them a really great review on Google, and I kid you not, my Google review has more views than most of my Instagram, which is just freaking hilarious. It's like thousands of views on my Google review. After my wonderful day on the West Coast, they call it the Pacific Rim of Vancouver Island, I headed back to the east side of the island because I was going to be leaving early in the morning to go back into the States. That night, I actually stayed at a campsite. I paid for a campsite because I wanted to make sure I had a place to camp, knowing that I was going to be getting there late. It was a lovely place. They had facilities that I was able to use. I stayed at a campsite. The next morning, I took a different ferry back into Washington, but this time I took the ferry that took me into Olympic State Park. I got into Olympic State Park and I hit some of the really beautiful places that were up in the northern area: Hurricane Ridge, Sudak Falls. I drove out to Rialto Beach, walked out to see the hole in the wall. I went into Forks, which is really cool because as you enter Forks, there's a sign, and on one side of it says vampires welcome, and on the other side it says no vampires allowed because the other side of it is indigenous land. Shout out to Twilight. And I just love that whole area, just plays into it. So that next night, I actually ended up staying at a campground in Olympic National Forest, and it was really close to the HOH rainforest, and that's why I stayed there, was because I wanted to get up early in the morning and go to the rainforest and hike through that. So I did that, and then I drove through Aberdeen to see some of the Kurt Cobain memorial things. There was a memorial I wanted to go see, and when I was on my way to it, the area just looked really sketchy and uncomfortable. I'm not sure why. There were people outside, and they just made me feel uncomfortable being a single woman, and like part of this memorial is under a bridge. I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't actually end up going to see that one. And I may have been totally off base. I'm not familiar with that area. I really do I follow my gut instincts, and I just didn't feel right about it. Maybe I'll be back that way with some other people and we'll feel comfortable seeing it, because I would like to see it. I ended up going and staying pretty close to the Oregon border for the night. Oh, I forgot. This was also the day that I was driving to where I was going to stay for the night and I needed gas. We're talking, this is southern Washington area. And I never would have thought that this would have happened in southern Washington. I could see this happening in Iowa, where I'm from, or maybe places in the South, but I needed gas. And the highway along the coast in Washington, there's just not a lot of populated places and like big name gas stations. There were small town gas stations, and there weren't very many of them. I was trying to find one that I was familiar with, but I was having a hard time finding one. I pulled into one and I got out, and when I got out, like, there were a couple men that kind of stood up and started walking outside. And when I got around to the pump, I realized that this was literally an old-fashioned pump. You could not pay at the pump with a credit card. It was one that had the little dials turned over. I didn't even realize that these still existed anywhere in working use in the United States. But I don't know. Something put the hairs on the back of my neck up, and it felt weird. So I got in my car and I was like, nope, I'm right out of here. And I ended up driving into Astoria, Oregon, and getting gas, and then back to where I was going to sleep for the night. Then the next day, I go into Oregon. I drove to Canyon Beach, and I walked out to see the ghost forest of Neskowin. I hope I said that. I don't know. But my plan at this point was to drive the Oregon coast, which I will, for now and ever, maintain is the most beautiful spot in North America. The Oregon coast is gorgeous. I drove out, I spent some time at Canyon Beach. I drove down and I stopped at Depot Bay. I looked at the viewpoint there, and actually from that point you could see the whales, which was absolutely amazing. Just being able to see the whales from the shore. So gorgeous. I got some videos of them. And I continued on to Devil's Punch Bowl, which I had been to the Devil's Punch Bowl before, and I loved it. It is gorgeous. The Devil's Punch Bowl is so beautiful, awe-inspiring. I actually created a piece of art based on one of the photographs that I took. I used one of my own photographs as reference for a piece of art that I created of the Devil's Punch Bowl. And then ended up driving to Devil's Lake campsite, where I camped for the night. Do you see why I named this my devil trip? Because so many places were named after the devil. Anyways, the next day I continued down the Oregon coast. I saw Cape Perpetua, Thor's The Devil's Churn, Heceta Head Lighthouse, and then I stopped at this cute little coffee place in Florence called Old Town Coffee, and I stayed there for a couple hours, worked on the computer and did some things, and chit-chatted a little bit with the lovely woman that owned it. She talked to me about how she had moved there years ago and opened up the place, and it was a great little retirement town. I have no idea the political climate of the place, but the town was freaking adorable. It is on my list of places to consider if and when I ever move to Oregon. So then I stopped at a rest area for the night, and the next day I entered California. I stopped in Crescent City, spent some time there. I drove down Howland Hill Road, went to Crescent Beach Overlook. I drove the Newton B. Drury Scenic Parkway, and all of these like different roads and parkways and things that I drove down, I frequently stopped and would get out and look at if there were places for me to like hike or short hikes or pullouts, I would do that. Like, I was just being very leisurely about it. Like, I had rough plans for what I was going to do each day, but I actually didn't solidify any of those plans until the day of or the night before, just in case something else caught my eye and I wanted to get off. I had a target for when I wanted to be home, but that was really the only thing that was driving me, was like a targeted end date. And I ended up walking through Fern Canyon, which was a much longer hike than I thought it was going to be. And it was very wet, but it was phenomenal. It was beautiful. That is one of the, I want to take some of those reference pictures and use some of those in some of the art pieces that I'm creating because it was so gorgeous. So then the next day, I stayed in a rest area in California. The next day I went to Eureka and I saw the Carson Mansion. I walked through historic Old Town. And I didn't stay very long because I wanted to drive down the Avenue of the Giants. I did stop at a lot of the enormous redwood trees and took pictures of them. I bought into the touristy thing and I drove through one of the redwoods at one of the little touristy areas. And then that night I stayed at a Pilot, which was the first time that I stayed at a truck stop, which is interesting because the Pilot was okay. But what I discovered on the back end of my trip was that I really loves truck stops. I loves truck stops. If I have the opportunity, if there's a Love's truck stop on my way when I am traveling, that is where I will stop and get my gas. If I'm car camping on a trip, that is where I will choose to stay because I don't know, I just love them. They're clean. The people are super friendly. Felt uncomfortable at any of them. So there you go. That's my tip. If you can stop at a Love's, do it. The next day, I entered Vacaville. I have family in Vacaville. I spent the next few days actually in Vacaville with my aunt and seeing my cousins, and I got to see my sisters, and I got to see my older brother who has since passed away. I did not get to see my younger brother, which I am super bummed about because I have not seen him since he was very little. I got plans cooking, and they do include more travel to more places in the United States. I'll be getting out that way again soon so that I can see my brother and sisters while I'm out there. So yeah, I spent time with family for a couple days. And then I left there, and this was my only other day that was mostly driving. And it was because I left Vacaville and I drove to the Grand Canyon. I drove pretty close to the Grand Canyon and then stayed the night. And then the next day I hit the Grand Canyon. And I will say that I only saw the southern and eastern rim of the Grand Canyon. I really wanted to see the northern rim, but if you know anything about it, it's like a 10-mile across trip, but it's 4 hours around, I think. Something absurd like that. I wasn't going to have the time to drive to the northern rim because I had somewhere that I wanted to go for that night. I went to Mather Point, I went to Yaqui Point, Desert View Drive. When I was on this trip, I had therapy. Like I had telehealth therapy visits and family therapy visits. So there were different days and different nights where I had to stop somewhere and park up that I could do therapy. You can't do that while you're driving. Anyways, this day I got there really late, and that made me nervous because I didn't know what to expect when I got there. I was worried there weren't going to be any campsites, but I found the biggest gem. It was on Navajo Nation land. It was a campground, and it was completely free, and it was near the Navajo Monument, which was also completely free. I got there really late, set up for the night, felt super comfortable, got up the next morning, explored the campground. It was so beautiful. Oh my gosh, it was so beautiful. There were prickly pear cactuses everywhere, and what do they call them? These little trees, pinyon trees or something like that. I don't know. I think they might have been like pine nut trees or something. There were signs saying don't pick things from them, which I wasn't planning on doing anyways. I wouldn't do that. But oh gosh, the prickly pear cactuses, which it if you know me, my favorite flavor is prickly pear. So getting to see all the prickly pear cactuses with their little blooms on them was so much fun. I did hike to the Navajo monument, which was lovely. Once I was done at the Navajo monument, I drove to the Four Corners monument. So I got to stand with one foot and one hand in 4 different states at the same time. I walked around and did a little shopping in all 4 states. It was really cool. I loved that. And then from there, I drove to Mesa Verde National Park and I stayed at their campgrounds for the night. And then the next day, I spent the entire day at Mesa Verde National Park. I saw all of the different pit houses. I saw all of the different cave dwellings. I wish that I had been in good enough physical condition that I could have went on one of the hikes down into one of the cave dwellings, but I just did not feel comfortable that I would be safe doing that. I had a shoulder that was needing surgery and my knees were not great. So I didn't do that. And then the plan was to drive and see Pikes Peak the next day. But by that time, I was actually getting really tired. I was having a harder time convincing myself to stay out and keep going. And by this point, we're 3 weeks into the trip here, baby. I decided that I would drive to, I think I drove just east of Denver. I was going to say Detroit. I was not in Michigan. I was in Colorado. So I drove up to just east of Detroit and stayed there for the night. And then the next day, I drove the most boring drive ever, which is Denver to Des Moines, because it is I-80 the entire way through Nebraska and Iowa, and it's so boring and flat, and there's nothing to look at, nothing exciting. But I drove home, and I got home safe and sound. I was extremely exhausted at that point. It was a wonderful trip, and I'm not going to say it's a once-in-a-lifetime trip because I plan on doing the same thing with the eastern states. Maybe not all at once in 3 weeks, but we'll see. Maybe I will. But I hit every state west of me except for North Dakota. So I spent time in every single state, and not just driving either. I got out and spent time in every single one of those states west of me on that trip, which I thought was quite a feat. It's interesting because I made a little map. I drew a little map. One of the pieces of art that I've created was a map of the United States, and it was every state that I went to in 2024. And it included all of those Western states, but then I also had a couple other trips that I went on in 2024 as well. So I included those. Maybe I'll pop a picture of that map here at the end of this video. But I know that this has been a long one. I really was just recounting my trip and what I saw. Maybe people find this interesting, maybe they won't. It was a life-changing trip. If you have not spent time traveling in whatever country you live in, but if you live in the United States, there are so many beautiful places to go and visit. I hit, I don't know, somewhere from 7 to 10 national parks and monuments on this trip. And I do have an America the Beautiful access pass. And so that really helped. But I encourage you to get out, see what is closest to you. If you're not someone that can take a huge long distance road trip or whatever, what's closest to you? Start there. What's in the state you're in or in the state next to you? Because I guarantee you there are things. Find them. Go explore them. Get out there. See what is in the world, because especially right now in this time that we are living in, when things are so difficult, finding pleasure wherever you can is so important. And nature is just one of those beautiful things that is just waiting for you to come and see it. So go and chase those waterfalls. Go see the rainforests. Go see the Grand Canyon. Go see your local park. I guarantee you it'll have something for you. If you have questions about the art that I'm creating in this video, or if you have questions about car camping or solo road tripping or anything, don't hesitate to leave them for me in the comments. If you have ever car camped, what's your biggest tip? What do I need to know for next time? Let me know. If you found value in this video, give it a thumbs up. If you are interested in videos about 80s and 90s nostalgia, road tripping, cats, plants, art, witchcraft, random things, a rambly woman with thoughts, whatever, if you're interested in any of those things, please click the subscribe button. I think there's a bell for some reason that I'm supposed to tell you to hit. But until next time, please know that you matter. I love you, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks.